Hey, good morning and welcome to Own the Morning. My name is Sammy, and man, what an honor to play a very small part in your day today. 2 Corinthians 5:7 is where we're going to spend a little bit of time. But before we do that, I have a question for those of us who have ever felt or do currently feel like we are behind in life, which is practically everybody. What if I told you that feeling like you are behind in life is actually a good place to be? Let me say that again. What if I told you that feeling like you're behind in life is actually a really good place to be? And what if I told you that almost every biblical great that we celebrate in the Bible felt like they were behind in life, even though they were exactly where God wanted them to be? Let me give you a couple examples. Father Abraham is one of the clearest examples. You guys remember him? Father Abraham had many sons. If you grew up in Sunday school, you remember that song. But can you imagine what it must have been like for Abraham when all of his, high school friends were having kids and inviting him to their graduation of their grandkids, and Abraham was still holding on to this promise that God gave him that he was going to be a father someday? I can imagine that for most of his life, Abraham felt like he was behind. And yet, what do we know looking back? We know that Abraham was exactly where God wanted him to be. What about Moses? You guys remember Moses? Let my people go, big bushy beard. I don't know if you know this or not, but Moses went from being the Fresh Prince of Egypt to being in the desert for a really, really long time. Can you imagine what it was like to spend 40 years just walking around the desert with a bunch of sheep, wondering what in the world happened to you? And yet, what do we know? Right? We know that even though he was in the desert for all those years, Moses was exactly where God wanted him to be. What about Joseph? Mr. God has a big plan and dream for my life, right? Joseph was a dreamer. He was a visionary until his brothers popped that balloon and they kidnapped him and sold him as a slave, and he's framed for rape. He's thrown in jail. Joseph is the classic story of 2 steps forward, 5 steps back. If anybody could ever make a case of being behind in life, it was Joseph. But come on now, people, what do we know? If you know a little bit of Joseph's story, we know, looking back in hindsight, that Joseph was where he was exactly where God wanted him to be. I'll give you a couple more examples. What about David, right? We all love to tell the story of David, but oftentimes we forget to include that David was sent to deliver cheese pizzas to his brothers when they were off to war after God had anointed him to be king. Okay, so just think about that for a second. God showed up. God sent the prophet Samuel, and he anointed David and said, you are going to be king of Israel. And after that, David had to go back to Papa John's to deliver pizza. Can you imagine what it was like for David just running all those deliveries, thinking to himself like, man, I must be behind God's call for my life? And again, what do we know? We know David was exactly where God wanted him. I'll give you one example from the New Testament, just in case you don't think I'm just picking from the Old Testament. Probably the greatest example in the New Testament is the story of Jesus. A lot of times we talk about the life of Jesus and his death and his resurrection. Well, what we fail to mention is Jesus didn't even begin his ministry until he was 30. You know what Jesus was doing for the first 30 years of his life after he became an adult and he could get a job? He was putting together furniture at IKEA. That's what Jesus was doing. He was a carpenter. And I don't know this for sure, but I wonder if Mary and Joseph ever pulled him aside and be like, hey, bruh, man, you are 28, you're 29. You might want to get this bus moving. You might want to get going about God's plan for your life. And I don't need to tell you that Jesus was exactly where God wanted him to be. I'll ask it again. What if those of us who feel like we're behind in life are actually exactly where God wants us to be? I love the way the Apostle Paul puts it in 2 Corinthians 5:7. I love the way he puts life following Jesus into perspective. He says, we walk by faith and not by sight. Okay, and in that specific context, he's talking about the resurrection and what that reality is going to look like. But I think in there also is a principle for life, right? That he's saying, hey, following Jesus is a walk of faith, right? We follow Jesus not by what we see around us. And I don't want to oversimplify what everybody is wrestling with, but my guess is that for most of us, the times when we feel like we're behind in life, the reason we feel like we're behind in life is because we're looking around at the people around us, right? We're looking at our friends and we're looking at our peers and we're looking at our families and people in our career fields. We're looking around and compared to them, we feel like we are behind. And what Paul is saying in 2 Corinthians 5:7, he's saying, hey, don't look around you. He's saying, look up, right? Don't look around you. Look up. Look up at what? Look up at Jesus. Look up at the cross. Look up at the one who has promised to work all things for the good of those who love him. Sounds like crazy talk, I know. But what if being behind is actually the new ahead? What if you are actually exactly where God wants you to be? And what if Lin-Manuel Miranda was right when he said this? He said this, their pace is not your pace. Their pace is not your pace. Their pace is not your pace. Be patient with yourself and find your pace. Their pace is not your pace. We walk by faith and not by sight. In the story of God, being behind is actually the new ahead. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with us at Own the Morning. Hope you tune in tomorrow. God bless you. See you later.